General Peter Wrangel was in charge of it and had orchestrated. There were about 126 ships that left from 5 ports on that day with about 150,000 refugees. And my grandmother and her family were one or three of them. And her ship only would accommodate like 1,500 people on it, but they had at that point they had like 7,000 people on it, and it was like rocking back and forth because it was so overloaded with people just living on the decks. Luckily they had a cabin, but it was so much fun to put together all the pieces of the history.
Join me, Jeremy Swick, on Into the Unknown, a podcast that delves into the personal journeys, stories, and experiences of individuals across diverse professions. As a historian by trade, I firmly believe that our personal histories shape our present and offer valuable insights into our paths ahead. With that being said, let's get into it. On this episode of Into the Unknown, I am joined with a very special guest, Tamara Buzyna Adams. How are you doing today, Tamara?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast today. I'm super excited to talk about history and genealogy.
I'm really excited as well. History and genealogy are right on my alley. It's one of my favorite subjects and kind of history. I just love history in general.
Yes, I do too. And what's kind of funny is before I wrote this book, Last Ship to Freedom, before I wrote this, I was not really that interested in history. I was always interested in like world history, that kind of fascinated me, but I was never like a huge history buff. But once I during COVID translated my grandmother's diaries, and I needed to learn what was going on during the time. It was 1920, 1921 when she wrote her diary. She was 11 years old and she was in the Black Sea. I needed to figure out, well, why did she move onto the ship that she was living on for what ended up being 18 months? What prompted her family to get onto the ship? So you have to know the history, you have to know the historical context of what's going on in that area, that geography, that area of where she was. So I became kind of obsessed with with history and was reading all about it and trying to figure out where she was during what was happening and everything. So it was very, very interesting to me. So now I'm a huge history buff.
It's so funny you mentioned that because I think it really is interesting where people find that connection to history because
Yes.
I think a lot of times, sometimes the way it's taught in school, it feels like something that happened really long ago and it doesn't relate to my life at
Yeah.
all. But the farther
Right.
you get into it, you're like, oh, wait, this is an exact correlation either to my family's
Yes.
personal history or honestly, a lot
Right.
of times what's going on in the world today. The more things change, the more things stay the same with history sometimes.
Right, right, exactly. Like, there was a big Crimea evacuation on November 14th, 1920. And, there's similar issues there today. So, it's 100 years later and it's still, a very familiar part of history. So, I feel very connected to that part of the world because that's where my ancestors came from. So I guess that makes me more interested in it, I guess, and more of a connection to it. And, I'd love to go visit. I have never been to Odessa where my grandmother was born. My parents have been there. But I have not. I've been to Kiev, but not to Odessa. But I hope, once things settle down over there, I'd like to go travel there, travel to Russia as well, since I have ancestors are from there as well. So just that whole Eastern Europe is just so fascinating to me, and how the borders change so many times.
It really is interesting. And I think sometimes as Americans, as we're celebrating our
Yeah.
250th anniversary,
Yes.
these countries and these areas are a lot older in that sense of more of the geographic borders. And so it is interesting how they've changed hands multiple times over decades, excuse me, over thousands of years, really.
Yeah. Right. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Like I'm fascinated with the ancient Greek ruins, and my grandmother. She spent a year on her steamship, living on it in the Black Sea for a year, and they would go out into into the Adriatic, and they went to Greece, and they went to I think it was called Halki Island, which I think is now part of Turkey. Or forgive me if I'm incorrect there, but she was fascinated by the history as well. And speaking of history, I brought this out because I thought you might be interested in it. My grandmother took with her a geography book, or history, actually Russian history book that had some geography information in it, on the ship with her in 1920. And this book is from actually 1913. So I thought you'd like to see this. This is the book here, her
Wow.
geography book. And it's really, really old, and typewritten and in Russian, of course.
Of
I have to
course.
use, I'm not fluent in Russian, so I have to use Google Translate. But it had a part on the United States. And at that point in 1913, I forget how many exact states there were, but there were not 50 states then. So it was really kind of fun to look and see what she was studying about America, on, in her history book that she had with her, that she saved.
It is absolutely incredible, and I appreciate you sharing that ephemera that lasts. I mean, that's 110, 113 years
Yeah.
ago, and it just shows what we value, because I'm sure that was somewhat of a
Yeah.
memory of traveling, but it's so incredible when
Yeah.
those things do survive.
Yes, yes. And she, like I mentioned, she wrote diaries at the age of 11. She wrote five. I have four of them here. The first one is up here next to my Lego Statue of Liberty that my dad built. Um, but she saved all these diaries, and we knew about them. We knew that she had diaries that she wrote about when she lived on the ship. We knew she lived on the ship, but we didn't really ask her, which is really one of the biggest regrets as a genealogist and historian. Is you always ask the oldest person in your family questions about their childhood and about their life experiences, and before it's too late. And unfortunately, we waited until it was too late, but luckily my mother and I, this was a COVID project in 2020 was when we started. And it was actually, ironically, exactly 100 years after she left uh, the former Russian Empire, because it was the Russian Empire when she was born in 1909. And then as she left, the Russian Civil War was taking place. The Bolsheviks were coming in, taking over all of it. Was the future Soviet Union, and the Crimea was the last holdout. And so they were down there in the south on Odessa. And she wrote these incredible diaries, and I'm going to show you her penmanship. This is an 11, remember, this is an 11-year-old girl, and she
Wow.
wrote, I think that's in focus.
Yes, it
She
is.
wrote very, you don't have to know Russian to know that that is incredibly, her penmanship was so meticulous, so beautiful. It was like a craft. It was gorgeous. And so, my mother was like looking for something to do during COVID. And so was I. I had, my husband went home, my two kids were home, they were in middle school and high school, and I needed something to occupy myself to stay sane, And so my mom decided one day that she was gonna translate the diaries. So that just threw us full throttle ahead with translating the diaries, digitizing them, gathering any kind of information we had, researching the historical events that happened. Like I mentioned, November 14th, 1920. I don't know how familiar you are with that historical event. But General Peter Wrangel was in charge of it and had orchestrated. There were about 126 ships that left from 5 ports on that day, with about 150,000 refugees. And my grandmother and her family were one, or three of them. And her ship only would accommodate like 1,500 people on it, but they had, at that point, they had like 7,000 people on it, and it was like rocking back and forth because it was so overloaded with people just living on the decks. Luckily they had a cabin, but it was so much fun to put together all the pieces of the history. I'm a big puzzle. I love puzzles. So this was like a big puzzle to me, involving genealogy and history, just my favorite things to do. So
It really is fascinating. As you mentioned, I always looked at history like a giant puzzle book in the sense of
yeah,
like, and as you mentioned, learning that context of what was going on outside of the 11-year-old's world,
yes,
which of course is
right,
somewhat limited, but also very expansive. As
yeah,
I'm sure they were talking
yeah,
about being on the ship and doing all that,
yes,
but you're able to now go back with that lens and look at, okay, what was the
yes,
bigger thing going on during this time? Why are they
right,
here? Why is the boat rocking so bad? You know?
right. Right, and we actually were lucky. We found so she didn't actually start her diaries until she was already a year on the ship. She started them January 29th, 1921, and I was able to, with different facts and things, I was able to discover that they boarded the ship in January, sometime in the first week of January 1920. So I was able to look at all the evidence from archives, from there were people that wrote memoirs or wrote about their description on the ship, and we actually found a general or some sort of military man that had written a memoir. He was actually on the Kherson, which is the ship. This is a painting of the ship right there. He was on the Kherson, and he actually described how they left, that they saw the horses, that were left behind, that were running into the water, and, how General Peter Wrangel was on his ship on the bow of the boat saying, it's, you don't have to come with me if you don't want to. This is, but, I will take you to safety. And, just he wrote down exactly what he said so you can picture it in your mind. It's almost like a movie kind of, you can picture what's happening. And he wrote about how the ship would rock back and forth, just with the uncertainty. And they would, announce over the intercom, move to the right, move to the left, that kind of thing. So, and I believe it was like a 2-day journey from they left from Sevastopol, on the Crimea, and they made it to Constantinople, which is, of course, today Istanbul. And so, if you can imagine, that's the only way to get out of the Black Sea. If you can imagine 126 ships coming to Constantinople, in a matter of like one day, or it probably took a couple days for some of the ships to get there. But, and they hung out there for a few days trying to, some people got off, some people got on. And, it was a big time of uncertainty. My grandmother always thought that they would, and her parents always thought that they would come back to Odessa, and they never did. And then after that, after one year there, they traveled up the Adriatic Sea, and they were in the Bay of Kotor, where Montenegro is. And the ship stayed there 10 months, but my grandmother's family was only there for like 8 months before they got off the ship. And then they went to like a Russian colony in Novi Sad, which was then Yugoslavia, and General Wrangel was in charge of helping all the Russian refugees and everybody that had come to Yugoslavia. So, and he actually came to her classroom one day. She actually went to school in Novi Sad, and I know that's like the biggest, like, one of my cousins was always fascinated by the story that my grandmother told, how General Wrangel came to her class and everyone greeted him that whatever the appropriate way was, and they're all saying hurrah, hurrah, and it says that was like such an impactful history. And, I'm sure I heard it when I was there, but, at that point I was like, I don't know who Peter Wrangel is. I don't know, but I just want to kick myself for not for not knowing about this, and or having the sense to, I was in college, I think, and I was, I had other things going on, but, I just wish I had the sense to ask her specifically about it. But, it's the information we received from all the research was life changing, because, I feel like I know her better now than I did when she was alive. I know her personality, her values. Even, as a child, I knew what was important to her, and, in turn, it kind of made me look inside myself, because the summer before COVID, before we started this project, I turned 50. So, that's a very a time of, looking back on your life and seeing what have you done, what do you want to do with your life. So it was all very, the timing was all very appropriate, I think, and it just made me do a lot more thinking, and it was more of a transformational journey for me, going through this, because I learned more about myself and my self identity. And, I felt like, her strength and resilience, lives through me. If she can go through, living on a ship for 18 months, leaving her country, the only place she knew, certainly I can deal with whatever I'm dealing with today, but yeah, so it's been an incredible experience in writing the book and putting all the pieces together, and all that's been really fun.
So I want to learn a little bit more about you as well. Tell me a little bit
Yeah.
about who you are, kind of your comic book issue number one, your origin story.
So my origin story is I grew up in Tallahassee, Florida, to two parents. My father was an immigrant. He arrived here in 1950 from what was then Poland, but it's now Western Ukraine. He was literally on the last train they left in 1944, as World War I was, or World War II was happening. Sorry. um, and he was like a little boy, and then they lived in a displaced persons camp in Germany, in Ingolstadt, for 5 years before coming to the United States. And he grew up in Chicago. And my mother, although she was born in New York City, both her parents were immigrants, also from Russia. Her mother, which is the one that I wrote the book about, was from Odessa, and her father was from St. Petersburg, born there. However, with all my genealogy research, we discovered that that my second great grandmother, I guess his great his grandmother, was actually from Finland, and she spoke Russian with a Finnish or and she spoke Swedish. They said she had a Swedish accent, and she was never married, despite the story that she was. I found a record that said that she was never married, and because of the DNA test that we took, we believe that the grandfather of my grandfather was also Finnish. So we have a little bit. I always thought we were 100% Russian, Ukrainian, Eastern European, but we do have a little bit of Finnish, which I thought was very, very interesting, because you always find surprises. But anyways, long story short, I grew up knowing about my Russian culture. Even though I didn't really speak it, I was surrounded by the language growing up, and I can understand more than I could speak. I can speak very simple, and I did teach. With this project, I was teaching myself how to read Russian records from the metric books that are written in script Russian, which is not easy. But I learned how to do that, and it's just so much fun. Um, so I've always been interested in the family history, but I guess obviously not enough to ask my grandmother's specific questions. But we do have tape recordings, like through our life, through our visits up in Chicago, and upstate New York, where my other grandmother lived. We would tape record stories that my grandmother's told, and so we translated them, and I tried to extract what information I could get from there, and would research that. um, but fast forward college, I actually went to school to be an occupational therapist, and I worked as a pediatric OT for about 10 years in South Florida, and then here in Atlanta. And then I had kids, and I kind of didn't continue my OT, but it was still always in the back of my mind. And I raised my two kids, and did a lot of volunteering in their schools, did photography, graphic design, kind of all self taught, kind of artistic, creative stuff. And, then in 2000, around 2000, my father and father, or I'm sorry, my husband's grandfather passed away. and he's got an interesting story as well. And they were telling me his immigration story from southern Poland, and so that was kind of the spark, or the impetus that really got me into obsessive genealogy. So it only happened like 26 years ago, which I guess I shouldn't say only, because that's what, a quarter of a century now. So I've been doing research ever since then. And, I would research their family because their family was in the United States longer than ours, and I could find stuff. And one day my mother's like, well, when are you going to research our family? so so then we kind of worked on our stuff, and now there's so much more stuff on online. But anyways, and then now this COVID project turned into a book. I had no intention of writing a book for public, knowledge or whatever, but it just happened that, as we were doing the research, it became so incredible. We discovered some descendants of my grandmother's best friend that she talked about in her diaries, and so we connected with that whole family. And we realized that this wasn't just my story to tell, that the story needs to be told, to multiple people, because it's a story that, of refugees that a lot of people can relate to, I think, today. But I'm just a passionate genealogist, first time author, pediatric occupational therapist, and I have my hands in a lot of different pots, so to speak. And I just have such an interest in family history, because I think it really connects you to your past, and it helps you understand yourself more. And I just feel like I hope that reading my book inspires people to look into their own family history and feel a connection to their ancestors, and bring it to their legacy, to their children's children's children. So
I really appreciate that outlook, and I think it's one of those things when the history bug bites you, and especially as you mentioned it, it's
yes,
so close to your family. As you mentioned, you like
yes,
genealogy, but really once you start doing that research, and I have to laugh that she
yeah,
mentioned that you're now digging through archives with script
yeah,
Russian. And I mean, if that doesn't excite you for wanting to learn more, it's like, because a lot of
yeah,
times, especially with the foreign side of the
yeah,
immigration story,
yeah,
a lot of people cut themselves off, understandably, at
right,
when they came to the States from Ellis Island
yeah,
or over the West
yeah,
Coast, depending on your nationality or kind of
right,
your time in life.
yeah,
But to go to that next level, that's always really exciting to
yeah.
me.
Yeah, yeah, and a lot of people feel intimidated about, researching in another language, and, Google Translate is great now. It really helps. I mean, I use it a lot. I do Facebook groups with translations. If I find something that, like, in script, like, Google Translate isn't great for translating script, but, I go on these groups, and they have, like, volunteers that will translate it for you for free. You can only do like one a day or something like that. So that's been super helpful. But yeah, it's a lot, and it's very addictive, and it's a never ending puzzle. So it's like you always want more. Like I always thought that this was all I was going to know. I only know up to my second great grandparents, not even all of them. And I just kind of resigned myself to think, well, that's all I'm going to know. But now that I learn little snippets of information, I'm like, oh gosh, I really want to know more. I want to know who their parents are. And it's like, it's just a never ending cycle. And um, it's just, I don't know, I'm just fascinated by it. It really is a obvious passion slash obsession, I guess you could say.
I completely understand how it goes in history. I am
Yeah.
curious. As you mentioned, this was an intention to create a book, but I assume
Yeah.
as you're gathering just stockpiles of more and more information, how did kind of morph from you understanding that story to, I guess, creating a story of your own?
Yeah, so, it's a nonfiction historical, book, so I tried to stay as true to what happened in the story in her diaries. I just kind of, initially, like I had said, I wanted to do the translations. She was, like, very, very precise. Every single day had the date, this is what she did, that's how she spent her day, and then the next day, next day, next day, and I was just gonna be like, "Okay, well, we'll just translate it and have it, like that." And my mother's like, "No, no, no, we need to write a story. We need to, put it put it into like a narrative, I guess you could say, which is what it is. So I had to, I have a lot of spreadsheets, and I would like put like, kind of like a story bank thing. Like I'd put all the stories from, when she was in the Bay of Couture. Well, these are the stories there that happened there. And so I would just kind of organize it in a little way like that. And then I would go back and I would write. I did not write. The book is in chronological order, the story part, but I did not write it in chronological order. I just kind of wrote whatever I felt moved to write at the time, I guess you could say. And I just had so much to write about, and it was just, and I wrote about my experience when I went on a cruise in 2023. It was, during this was actually before I decided to write the book, but I knew that she was in the Bay of Couture, Montenegro. And I was like, oh my gosh, I have to go on this cruise. And so I felt such a connection with her. And I was holding my phone up in the bay there on the top of the cruise ship. And I held up my phone with a picture of her on her ship in the same bay, trying to see if I could, find the silhouette of the mountains where she was possibly anchored. And I hope to go back, to where she was, to the actual city that she was. But I felt such a connection. Traveling to the place that your ancestors are from is so incredible, and such an incredible experience of connection. And so that, even though she wasn't from there, she only spent 8 months of her life there, it was still a really cool experience. But yeah, that was very interesting. I think very fun,
Oh,
I guess, for lack of a better word.
no, absolutely, absolutely. Now, tell me a little bit more about the book itself. Where can people find it? How and the title
Yeah.
and all that good stuff.
So here's the book right here: Last Ship to Freedom, Uncovering My Grandmother's Tale of Fleeing Post-Imperial Russia. And this is my grandmother in her favorite little sailor suit sitting on the deck of the book. And the first portion of the book is her story that I extracted from her diaries and from the research that I discovered of what happened during that time. And then the second portion, the ship, after it left the Bay of Couture, it went to Malta for another 2 years. But she was not on the ship then. But I did write about what happened, because the family that we got in touch with, the descendants, they were on the ship through Malta, and they came to the United States about a year after my grandmother did. So I included that because my hope is that somebody will read the book and realize that one of their ancestors was on the ship as well. Um, and uh, then the next part I write about, if you're interested in genealogy and doing family history research, I just wrote some of my basic tips on how to get started, because I can't tell you how many people I've talked to that say, "Oh, my great grandmother gave me this big bin of photographs and documents and I don't know what to do with it." And I like just drool at hearing that, because I'm like, I would love to get my hands on there and organize it. And so I have a bunch of tips on how to address a big pile of stuff that you don't know what to do with. And then in the very back, I have an appendices that has a list of all the crew members that was on the ship, that we found in the archives. And I also have maps of where the ship was. And then I also have, my grandmother had mentioned some recipes that her mother had made a few times, or that they had eaten. So I added some family recipes from my family, of those that she mentioned in her diaries. So and then I have, of course, a bibliography of where we got all the information from. But it's, like I said, I hope this inspires people. I hope it inspires you to look into your family history if you haven't done that as well. And the book is available in hardback and paperback and Kindle on, anywhere you can buy books, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, I believe. And I do have an audiobook coming out soon. So that's where you can get it. So
Well, that is incredibly exciting. I can't wait because I'm definitely going to pick
yes.
up a copy now. I love history. I love
Yes.
reading. It's like the perfect combination then.
Yeah, yeah, it really is, and, the fact that that's my family history and, it's just it ins and it even though it might not be everybody's family history, I just hope it inspires people to look into their historical history.
I really appreciate that. So, title of the podcast, Into the Unknown. What are you working on now besides the book? Is there more research coming? What are you up to, and where can people learn more about your story?
Well, I do have a website. It's tamarabuzynaadams.com. And I'm on Instagram at author Tamara Adams. And I've not started it yet, but I do intend to write a second book. I've got a couple different ideas of what I'm going to work on. So I definitely want to, and it will be related to genealogy and history, of course, as well. And I just, want to spread the information out that everybody can look into their family history. So that's what's next for me.
Well, Tamara, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me. I'm excited to get that book. I literally am going to order it later today, and I can't wait to read it
Oh,
because it's going to be one of those that I know I'm going
thank
to
you.
go through. And one of the things I
Yes.
really appreciate as a historian, and I worked as an
Yeah.
archivist myself, is those genealogical
Oh,
tips, because a lot of what
yeah.
I got was people reaching out asking, where do I start?
Yeah.
Thankfully, if they were local, I
Yes.
could have them come in. And I mean, we
Yeah.
went through one of our donations, and I'm going a little bit of a tangent because I don't think you'll mind.
Yeah, no, you're good.
He was a soldier in World War II at Camp Lejeune, except he
Okay.
was also an African American. I was at the Wisconsin Black
Yeah.
Historical Society, and it was so cool to see him because he was a little bit, one of those amateur photographers. Later on, became a family photographer, and then created a business
Oh,
post war.
yeah.
But it was so cool to see him because a lot of times you would see the white soldiers in very similar,
Yeah.
lounging in the
Right.
hammock, playing with the platoon dog or things like that.
Yeah.
But it was so cool to see African American soldiers in the same
Yes.
lens as their white soldiers, and a lot of times they were together because it's the war and you're
Right.
together in that sense. But
Yes.
it's one of those things that I loved helping people with genealogy questions. And
Yeah.
I have to laugh because over can't see it. There's like 7 or 8 cartons of family photographs that I've slowly been
Oh,
digitizing. There's letters I can't wait to go
yes.
through. Sometimes it's finding
Yes.
the time in the day and just not
Yes.
just reading them. I'm
Yes.
like, all right, let me think of an action, because sometimes I'm just sitting there reading, my grandparents
Yeah.
sending letters back and forth, and it's just always that
Yes.
connection to that family history is something I admire.
Yeah, yeah, and then you can see, like, I read about my mother's grandfather that he loved photography in the 1920s of all times in Russia, and I'm like, my mother always loved photography, I love photography, my kids love photography, so it's just really cool to find out that you have an ancestor you had no idea was interested in what you were, so you never know what you're gonna find when you look at all that information. So if you ever need any help, I'm looking to start a business and help so that I can help other people, go beyond the names and the dates of a family tree and find their stories that are waiting to be told.
Well, I really appreciate that. Thanks again. We'll talk soon.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Another fun episode of Into the Unknown. I truly appreciate you taking the time to listen. And if it provides you any value or entertainment, I would love if you shared it with others, liked, subscribed, and really just help the podcast grow. Again, tell a friend, tell a foe, just anyone who might enjoy hearing some stories of people's own journeys and what got them to where they are today. Till next time.